Luke 12:34. While you're turning there, last week we talked about Jesus continuing about trying to eliminate sources of worry from the lives of those there in the crowd that he was dealing with. And part of that's that we're not just here to survive. I mean, we're already guaranteed to survive as Christians. We're guaranteed to have life eternal that's not going to end. It's not just about surviving and waiting till we get to glory. It's not trying to extend our life necessarily here, and worrying sure not going to do that. That word helikia, which is either maturity of age or maturity of height. You can't worry about getting taller. That's not going to fix it. You can't worry about getting older. That's not going to fix it either. But we did talk about some things that if you do want to live a longer life on the earth, now we know God has a set amount of time for each person. A fullness of days is the way the Bible describes it. That's different for every person. You're not guaranteed a certain point, and then I've heard people say, well, you're supposed to live to be 70, and then if you're a bad person, you shorten that, and if you're a good person, you lengthen that. That's not true. That's not true. God has a set amount of time for each person. You can extend that amount of time to some degree or shorten that, but it's not the same for every person. And part of that is the first commandment with promise, how to extend that. It's honoring your father and mother, the things that they've taught you in the Lord. That's the first commandment with promise. And we talked about there from Proverbs 16:31, a righteous life. That's a gray hair is not a shame to a person if it's lived by righteous living. If you get to be an old person by living a righteous life, that's not a shame to be gray-headed. My brother took a video of me today, and I realized just how much bald-headed I'm getting in the back. It's getting worse all the time. But good news is I can't see it in the mirror from the front, so it doesn't bother me. And it looks just like mine. His looks just like mine, so that's fine. But another way is avoiding forms of idolatry, actually serving God. That can not only extend our days, but it results in healthy offspring, eliminates sickness, those kind of things that I know God allows sickness for different reasons, but some of that is because we aren't really serving God. And He's trying to give us a wake-up call to use our health and our strength for Him. And so, there are a lot of ways walking in God's ways will help keep us in a place of blessing. I hope God keeps us in America in a place of blessing. But we see the way our country's turning away from God. I don't anticipate that to continue a whole lot longer, but I hope God comes back and takes us home before it gets too bad here. But those are the things that we should be concerned about, how to live for God, not worrying about, are we going to get an extra year, an extra day, an extra month to live on the earth. And, you move into this next question that Jesus asked, and it's going to be right at the end of this, so you bear with me. But He changes. All these things that we talked about were things about worrying, all at that one scene. If you remember out of the Pharisees' house there, they come out of the house there, and then all those things, these next several things are just worry things that the crowd's worrying about. This is changing to stewardship, right? And if you remember, we talked about this earlier, these same ideas you see from the Sermon on the Mount. There in Matthew 5 through 7. The same principles that He's going through again, worrying Galilee at that time. And that was more of a private setting initially there with the Sermon on the Mount. He comes down off the mount, rejoins the multitudes there in the plain, and we get what's called the Sermon on the Plain. And you read that account, and it's almost identical to the Sermon on the Mount. It's the exact same principles reviewed again. And then they come here to Judea, down out of Galilee, and come down into the region of Judea, and it's almost identical again. And if you read these portions of Scripture separately, you'd think, oh, okay, that's just a different author writing about the same thing. And it's not. It's in a different place. And this is now for the apostles, this is the third time at least they've heard these same principles. Right? Why is that? They're going to have to continue giving those principles to the rest of the world when Jesus goes back to heaven. Those 12 people are going to be the main source of that information, and they need to know it well. Right? And same thing, we come to church, and it's not brand new information every time you come to church. It's a lot of review, isn't it? Things that we've heard from the time we were little, if you grew up in church, or your whole adult life, and those same things over and over again, and we want to get them down inside to make sure we know them. You can't share them with everybody else if you don't know them. And that's the purpose there. But you look at those things that Jesus dealt with, and they're all about worry, anxiety, fear, something like that. Even when he comes out of the house there and the Pharisees come out, and you remember we've talked about this several times now, they're just bombarding him with those questions, and they're just hostile and hatred, and they really didn't do a good job of hiding. Pharisees, for the most part, they hid their wickedness on the inside really well. They're really good moral people. This instant shows exactly what's on the inside. And Jesus was trying to show that to them. And, the worry is that when they come out, one of those groups has to be wrong. It's either got to be the Pharisees and the religious leaders, the scribes and those groups, or it has to be Jesus and his disciples. They both can't be right because they're going against each other there. And that's the worry. Are we on the right side? Are we following the right group? That's the kind of the worry among the crowd there. These religious leaders we've known most of our life, and Jesus has just been in the ministry here about 3 years, and which are we on the right side? And that's the worry there. And then of course he addresses materialism and the worry about having enough stockpiled on this side of eternity instead of the treasures on the other side. And then he addresses the worries that most of the culture faced, which was just feeding themselves, clothing themselves. That was kind of a general concern on a daily basis. You had to be able to provide those things regularly. And then Jesus warns about worrying that last time about extending their life, about living a longer time here. And so look back at Luke 12, verse 34. This is right at the end of that before we go on to the next part. But Luke 12, 34, I didn't read this last week, but this is the same idea, and you see this in Matthew 2 and in earlier in Galilee from Luke's account. But he says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And that's really good. He's not just talking about money things. He's not just talking about those. He's addressing those same things that he's just tried to alleviate the worry that people are having about. Some of that is material things. Right? Some of that's about dying here on earth, physical death, the other things there. But, if we treasure this life the most, what's our heart going to be focused on? This life. Right? This life. If our treasure is in the next life, we're going to be focused more on that part of eternity there. And same thing, if we treasure the things of this world the most, we're going to be putting our heart into accumulating things on this side of eternity. Where if our heart's on God's things, then we're going to spend our time investing in God's kingdom, beginning with tithing, giving, helping others, those kind of things, and that direction. So, if we treasure our physical body here the most, we're going to be more focused on eating right and exercising and doing those kind of things, and those things are profitable. Right? Bodily exercise, it profiteth little. It is some profit, but the best profit for us is righteousness. The other side of that. And so, all those things are about preparing for the future. Have they attached themselves to the right kind of religion? Have they gained enough money that they can provide for themselves? Have they provided enough, stored up enough, got enough clothes, got enough things like that, and done enough to extend their life into the future there? And after he addresses those worries there that most people struggle with at least some point in their life, that they do that. But, at some point, we're going to meet the Master. And that's what he's focusing on now, is stewardship. What we've done here, because we're going to meet the Master. And whether that be through the rapture of the church when God calls us home prior to the tribulation period, or if we go in death, we're still going to meet the Master one way or another there. And so, first he starts off here, and we'll look at verse 35 and 36. And this is about being prepared to serve. And these first couple verses is what is expected of a good steward. What does God expect us to do in order to be a good steward, to be found faithful. Verse 35 and 36 of Luke 12, he says, "Let your loins be girded about, and your lights burning, and ye yourselves like unto men that wait for their Lord, when he will return from the wedding, that when he cometh and knocketh, they may open unto him immediately." And so Jesus is giving some kind of expectations of a good steward, a person who's trying to serve God. And he gives three things. These are three things that all Christians should be doing. Right? And I know it's geared kind of to their culture, but the principles still apply to us there. And the first one starts off with, "Let your loins be girded about." And that's an interesting phrase there. But the dress of that culture was what? Robes, long robes. Right? If you ever see pictures, it's a pretty good accurate picture. They come down almost to their feet. They're long and full-length robes there. And, that was the dress of that time. They did that for modesty, right? To keep your, private parts all covered. You don't want a short robe for the most part. And they did that for warmth in the winter seasons and those kind of things there. But, but the dress in those long robes did hinder certain activities. You couldn't do those very effectively with the robe long like that. And so look over in 2 Samuel 10. You see some things that are hindered. And they did this. They girded up the loins. And we'll talk about exactly what that is in just a minute. But you see some instances where that's necessary to do that. To gird them up there. In 2 Samuel 10, look at verse 4 there. Just a minute. But David, what's happened is another king, an enemy king actually, has died. It's the king of the Ammonites. And David, he had showed kindness to David at one point in his life. And David, when the king dies, his son is taken over. And David is trying to show kindness to the king's son. That's what he's trying to do there. And he's sending a gift there with his servants. But instead of accepting David's gift, some of the advisors accuse him that, David's sending spies down here. Right? The king's died, new person. That was a common thing when a new king took over before they established themselves well, that an enemy would attack. They're kind of disorganized. They haven't understood how to follow the leadership of the new king there, and they try to take advantage of that. And so that's what the new king assumes is happening. His advisors have told that. And then 2 Samuel 10 and verse 4, God bless you. He says, "Wherefore Hanan took David's servants and shaved off the one half of their beards and cut off their garments in the middle, even to their buttocks, and sent them away." Now, they disgraced them there by cutting off half their beard. Right? That was not acceptable in Jewish culture at all. Very disgraceful to have that. And then they cut their robes off right there. Okay? So they couldn't hardly walk without exposing themselves. Right? They're so short. Right? They cut them off there at that point. And of course they can get other robes, but their beard's not going to grow back right away. And so if you read the rest of that account there, that David sends them and lets them go to Jericho for a while there, and they stay until their beards grow back, until it's not ashamed anymore to come back with their own people. But other occasions, they did need to shorten their robes. They did need to do that to be more active. There's some types of labor required that, some types of travel required that. If you wanted to travel in a hurry, you didn't want those robes maybe dragging on the ground or getting caught on things, and so they gird them up. Definitely when you fought in battle, you wanted to have those short and bound close to your body where they weren't swinging and in the way. But, one of those instances when the people, look over in Exodus chapter 12, we'll look at a few of these, but Exodus chapter 12 and verse 11, this is when God's people are getting ready to leave Egypt. This is during the Exodus. And Exodus 12 and verse 11, they're preparing to travel, and God tells them to gird up their loins. Right? They're going to need to leave in a hurry. They need to be ready to travel. And they don't want any kind of hindrance when that time comes. And this is right before the Passover. They're the last plague before they leave Egypt. He says, says, and thus shall ye eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand. Ye shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So they gird up their loins so they're ready to leave. That's the whole idea by taking the Passover that way. And so, another thing, 1 Kings 18 verse 46, if a person had to run, like an errand or something like that, they wouldn't have that long robe hanging down. They would gird it about. 1 Kings 18 and verse 46. It says, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. And that was another instance of that. And of course, the final one's over, and we'll read the account from Ephesians. You see this multiple times in Scripture. But Ephesians 6, verse 14 is very common to us. That's where a person's putting on the whole armor of God. In Ephesians 6 and verse 14, it's a picture of a soldier there, and a soldier would do that. They gird up their loins there. And of course, we get the spiritual application of that in Ephesians 6:14. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness. And so all of those things describe certain activities that was necessary to gird up the loins. And I didn't really understand exactly how that happened until this past week, and I was studying about it. And I'm going to try to demonstrate this. I probably should have brought a sheet or something like that, but you can figure it out. It's pretty easy. But when they had those big long robes hanging down, ankle length, okay, they pull up that extra material and get it up above their knees. Okay, so you imagine pulling that material up above your knees, and they gather it here in the front and pull it tight against the back there, and they tuck it between their legs. Okay, and when they tucked it between their legs, they bring it back out here and divide it up again in like halves. Right? They pull it around the front here, and then tie it or tuck it in the sash of their robe. Okay, and basically looks kind of like a diaper. Right? It does. Looks kind of like a diaper, but what they end up with is the cloth is all bound tight around this area, and it's, of course, closing off all of these areas. It makes it very modest, right? It conceals all of the parts it's supposed to conceal, even though it's short. Right? It's not like when David's servants got their robes cut up here and they were afraid to walk because everything was going to show. Right? Everything is closed up nice and tight there, and they can do more things, move around more easily, do work easier that way, and of course run and do things quicker. John 13:4, Jesus did this. This is at the Last Supper, and here in this example, Jesus is washing the disciples' feet there. He's going to have to move around on the floor. The disciples, the eating, they kind of lounged leaning forward like on a bench instead of seated at a bench like we do. So their feet would be out behind them that way, and Jesus is going around behind them on the floor, and he's washing their feet there. And there in John 13:4, he says, he rises from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. And so the same kind of idea, just with another towel to dry their feet with, and he girds that about himself that way, and he's ready to serve. And that's the same idea in Luke 12, verse 36. It was common for servants to do that, to be able to serve in a greater way. They could move around the table and do things around the house, and then when they weren't serving, they could let that back down. But Luke 12, verse 36, this is the idea. He says, and ye yourselves like unto men that wait for their Lord when he will return from the wedding, that when he cometh and knocketh, they may open unto him immediately. Now right before that, they have their loins girded about, but the master's not there. Right? That's very interesting. Right? That they're doing the task that they were told to do, even though the person who they work for is not there with them. And it's a wonderful picture of our service for the Lord. They're serving the Master even though he's left, but they're anticipating him coming back. That's the whole idea there. They've been doing all the responsibilities that he's required, and when the Master returns back from the wedding, they're ready to continue serving. It's not one of those that they're waiting for him to come back so they can serve him. They've got their loins girded about. They're serving him even though he's not present with them. And that's you see some Christians today, they feel it's the opposite. I'm going to wait until the Lord comes back, and then we'll serve Him for eternity. And that's not what the picture that Scripture gives us. We serve Him now, waiting for Him to come back, and then we'll continue to serve Him. It's not where we're going to wait for Him to come back and then we're going to serve Him throughout all eternity. You serve Him now. And that continues on into eternity. But, they look at another thing that's required of a good steward, besides having their loins girded about, which means they're ready to serve. There in verse 35 again of Luke 12, let your loins be girded about and your lights burning. Right? It isn't just that they're prepared to serve, the lights are burning. Now, the actual marriage feast lasted about how long? Average. A week. Right? It's a long festival. They celebrated for a whole week. The espousal period usually lasted about a year, right? And then the wedding feast lasted about a week. Right? And from what I understand, it's not day and night, a week-long feast, right? Most people, if you had several people that got married, you couldn't take off a week of work for each person there. That's kind of not really the idea there, but people would accomplish their work during the day, and they might go and celebrate with the family in the evenings. They'd have the meal, right? They'd celebrate and talk and fellowship with each other, and that went on every evening for a week. And then the wedding ceremony would be over. And Matthew 5, verse 14. Matthew 5, verse 14. And they would go celebrate with the family in the evenings. And the idea is, regardless what hour of night the master comes home from the wedding celebration, they have the lights burning. That's the idea. They have the lights burning. And Matthew 5, verse 14, of course, this is earlier on the Sermon on the Mount, the first instance that we talked about with the apostles. They get to hear this information. He says, you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And I went to my father-in-law's this past week and had to run a little wire for him in his attic there. He gave me a little flashlight. I did take one of them headlamp things, but I don't like to wear them because they give me a headache. But I do out of necessity sometimes. But because I was trying to hold his little flashlight, and I was trying you know how that works. You ain't got somebody to hold the light for you. And so I got that little LED headlamp thing and put it on. And it was in the middle of the day, but it's in his attic. Right? And so it's still dark there. Right? It's still dark. I would not have been able to do that little task without that light. It's just impossible to get up there and grope around in the dark and try to do that. Right? And you've probably had similar things where it's the middle of the day, but somewhere in your house it's dark. The closet's dark, or the garage is dark, or the basement's dark, or the bathroom, something. And even though it's light somewhere, it's dark there. And that's the idea. It doesn't matter how much light there seems to be in the world, it's still full of darkness. The world's still full of darkness, and so the world needs the light that we have to offer, and it's full of sin, and so we're trying to shed light on that, show them that they need something there, but it's not something we turn on and off. Right? That's what he's talking about. They keep the light burning. It's not something that they say, oh, well, I think the master's going to come home. We'll light the lamp now. We'll light the candlestick. We'll do that. No, it's something we have on all the time. We don't just have it on at church and then go home and we'll flip it off, save electric. No, we're going to have our light burning for God all the time. Whether we're in church or out, and act the same way both ways. And it's always shining. Look back at Luke 12:36 again. Luke 12, verse 36, this is the third thing there. They have their loins girded about. They've got their lights burning. And then in Luke 12:36 again, he says, and ye yourselves like unto men that wait for their Lord when he will return from the wedding, that when he cometh and knocketh, they may open unto him immediately. That's the third thing for the good steward. They're ready to open unto him immediately. When the master comes back, there isn't anything that's been left undone. There isn't anything that they need to do for him to be welcomed home. They don't have to tidy up the house, right? I remember as a kid when my parents once in a while, they would leave my sister with us. She's a couple years older than us, and they'd say, now your sister's in charge. And they'd leave us there at the house, and she'd tell us things to do, and we just totally ignore that. Just do whatever we wanted to. We knew about what time they'd be home. Right? We'd tear out toys, we'd do everything that we wanted to. When it got close to time for them to come home, then we'd go tearing around the house, cleaning up toys and doing all the things and putting stuff up, and so she couldn't tell on us. Right? And she'd come home, Mom and them come home sometimes, and she'd say, they tore out this and they played ball in the house and they did that. Well, there wasn't any evidence. We'd already cleaned it all up. But that's not what's going on here. It's not like they've neglected to do those things and then hurried up and tried to get them done when they realized the master's coming home. It's not. They've done everything they were supposed to do, and when the master comes, everything's already ready. It's ready. And when God's ready to take us home, there shouldn't be anything that we've left undone. Shouldn't be anything that we're ashamed of. If Jesus came back right now, there shouldn't be anything in our life that we're ashamed that's still there, that we've held on to for some reason. And so those are traits of a good steward. They're ready to serve. They got their loins girded about. They can be more active, do more things. The lights are always on. They can see to serve. The world can see the light in their life there, and there isn't anything that might cause them shame there when the master returns at any moment. Those are the expectations that Jesus gives of the good steward. And then he moves on through verse 37 and 38. These are the blessings. If you're doing the things that are expected of a good steward, there's blessings that follow that from God. Luke 12, 37 and 38, he says, blessed are those servants whom the Lord, when he cometh, shall find watching. Verily I say unto you that he shall gird himself and make them to sit down to meat, and will come forth and serve them. And if he shall come in the second watch or come in the third watch and find them so, blessed are those servants. Now the first blessing there is the blessing associated with anticipation. They're watching for the master's return. And we saw a portion of that from Leroy's Sunday school lesson there in 2 Timothy 4:8. You don't have to turn there if you don't want to. I'll read it to you. I'm sure you'll recognize it. We just had that this past Sunday. But in 2 Timothy 4, verse 8, he says, henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. And that's that special crown, that special reward that God is going to give to all his children who are anticipating Jesus' return. They're looking forward to it. They love his appearing. There isn't anything that they're dreading to leave behind. Here, I just want to live just a little bit longer. I want to see my grandkids get a little bigger. I want to see my kids get married, or I want to see something. I don't want to leave this yet. That's not loving the Lord's return. If you got to get something else done here before you go, you're probably not going to get that crown. That's the blessing of that, and that's the anticipation of it, that we're looking forward to it. We're more attached to the other world to come, eternity, than we are to this, and there's a blessing associated with it. The next blessing there is being served by the master. That's an interesting concept there in verse 37. The master will gird himself. He'll gird his loins like a servant, like Jesus did with the towel when he washed his disciples' feet. And he's going to serve them a meal. It says he'll make them to sit down to meat, and he will serve them. They'll be served by the master. That's a little difficult, for me at least, to kind of wrap my head around, because I know we're going to serve God and worship him throughout all eternity. And for him to serve us, I had a hard time wrapping my head around that at first there. But our service to God, if we go home right now, we'd go right to heaven. That's heaven now is what we would know as the New Jerusalem. You see that described as the New Jerusalem, the streets of gold, right? The dwelling place of God right now. And if we go to be with him in heaven right now, we'll be serving him there. And then when he comes back after the rapture of the church, when he comes back at the end of the tribulation period, we'll come back with him. Right? And then he'll set up his reign on the earth for 1,000 years. We'll get to be with him in some capacity, serving here on the earth. At the end of the 1,000-year reign, that's when the earth is remade. Right? It's quenched of all signs of sin by fire. It's remade, the new heavens, the new earth. And then the New Jerusalem, the heaven now, comes down to the earth, and those become the same place. The new earth and the New Jerusalem are heaven. That's where God will be, and His people will be with them there. And that's an amazing thing. But, certain things there you see. Look at Revelation 19. When we get to be with Christ at the rapture of the church, that's the marriage of the Lamb. That's what we know as the marriage. The church is the bride of Christ. The church is the Christians in this age, the church age, since Jesus went back to be with Him in heaven. And the marriage celebration with the Lamb is the bridegroom, which is Christ, and the church, the bride, which is us, the saints in this age. That's the marriage. Revelation 19, verse 7 and 8 says, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to Him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and His wife hath made herself ready. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of saints." Right? And so we're going to be reunited with the bridegroom as the bride. And we'll have that pure white garment, which is the righteousness of the saints. How did we get that pure white garment? That's Christ's righteousness on us. We know what our righteousness is. We talk about it all the time. The filthy rags. Right? Our garment's not clean and white all on our own. Right? It's not something good we did on our own. That's in Matthew chapter 22, you look back there and you get the same description there in Matthew 22. You get this description of a wedding there. How God invites both good and bad to be a part of the wedding. They're all there, invited to the wedding ceremony. But you have to get the garment to get to be a part of the ceremony. You can't just come in your own dirty clothes, right? That's what happens in this illustration in Matthew chapter 22 in verse 11 and 12 there. And Jesus points out, He says, "And when the king came to see the guests, he saw there a man which had not on a wedding garment. And he said unto him, Friend, how camest thou in hither not having a wedding garment? And he was speechless." That's exactly the answer that you would expect from a person who stands in judgment before God and they haven't accepted Christ. They don't have that pure white robe. They don't have any righteousness there, any appearance of purity there. And you see that from Romans 1 verse 20. They're without excuse. They're going to stand there, I believe, just exactly like Matthew 22 describes, speechless before God when God says, "Why didn't you accept the gift that I gave you?" And they're going to have no answer for that. Right? None. They're going to know, I believe God's going to make it evident right there in that point in time. These are the opportunities that you had. You had this chance to go to church. You had this opportunity to accept the gospel at this time, and God's going to make that aware to them. It's all going to come right back flashing to them, and so I don't believe they're going to be without any excuse. They'll just stand there speechless there. And then verse 13 of Matthew 22, "Then said the king to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." That's why hell is going to be their home. They don't have the garment. They can't get in to the marriage of the Lamb. There, they can't participate in that. And so then you see back in Revelation 19 again, that's the marriage ceremony, the uniting of Christ with His bride, which is the church. That's the blessing that Jesus is describing in Luke chapter 12. But look at verse 9. Revelation 19 and verse 9. They're going to be served by the Master. And this is where I believe this comes into play in Revelation 19 verse 9. He says, "And he saith unto me, Right, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he saith unto me, These are the true sayings of God." Now the marriage is in heaven. Where's the supper? Well, if you read right after that, they invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. They're called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. You continue on there, Revelation 19. You can read that for your own. It immediately goes back to the earth, right? That's the end of the tribulation period. Jesus immediately goes back to the earth. You see the battle of Armageddon. Jesus sets up his throne there in the temple, and he rules for 1,000 years. I believe the marriage supper of the Lamb is on the earth. But that's where Christ will actually serve us there at that supper. Just like it girding his loins about there, and they'll be served by the Master the way Luke describes it there. And it wasn't uncommon for the bridegroom, especially in this culture, to serve the guests at their own wedding. Now that's a little unheard of in our culture today. Most of the time the bridegroom and the bride, they don't go around and check on people like that. I did appreciate that at Leroy's wedding, though. Did you notice that at Leroy's wedding? They all come around. I don't know if they did your table or not, but they did mine. Right? They come in there and they said, "You all have enough food? Did you get dessert? Did you got enough to drink?" And they come over and talk to us there at the table, and that's not uncommon there. But Ricky didn't tie her wedding dress up into a diaper to do it, but they did come around and check on you, and it's that same kind of idea there. I believe that'll be similar to the marriage supper of the Lamb there, and the focus will be on Jesus. But he'll give us the blessing of serving us there for the supper. And we'll serve him throughout all eternity, 1,000 years, and then on into eternity. Back in Luke chapter 12, verse 38. Luke 12, verse 38. And he says, "And if he shall come in the second watch or come in the third watch and find them so, blessed are those servants." So there's the blessing of anticipating the return of Christ. There's the blessing of being served by him at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then this final blessing there, the blessing of being found faithful. Right? Found faithful there. That's the idea. It doesn't matter when it happens. No matter when the master comes back, the steward is ready. He's found faithful. In the Old Testament, the Jews divided the night into 3 watches. Anytime you see a watch mentioned in the Old Testament, it's only 3 watches. There's never a 4th watch mentioned, right? And they would have 3. It starts at basically 6 o'clock in the evening, and they were 4 hours at a time, 6 to 10, 10 to 2 a.m., 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., and then the new day started. Right? And so, but that was the watches. In the New Testament, though, the Romans had 4 watches. And you see that when Jesus is with his disciples there in the 4th watch of the night or the 3rd watch of the night, and they use those descriptions in the New Testament. But they had 4, and they were only 3 hours long. So they went from 6 to 9, 9 to midnight, midnight to 3 a.m., and 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. But he's using, obviously, probably those 4 watches there, and he uses the reference there, the 2nd watch and the 3rd watch. If the master of the house went to a week-long wedding feast and they participate in the evening, and they wouldn't expect them to leave work all week like we talked about earlier, and so they would probably work during the daylight hours, and then about dark, right, they'd go to the wedding feast and they'd celebrate with the family there, maybe about 6 o'clock. And if you have a meal with somebody and you fellowship along, how long does that usually take? Usually how long? I mean,
30 minutes.
Yeah, you can eat in 30 minutes, but if it's family or somebody you're trying to catch up with or somebody you don't get to see, yeah, you can have a couple hours, right, involved in a meal there, and I guess there's something like that. They go have a meal, they socialize for a couple hours. Most people would be back by 8 or 9 o'clock, wouldn't they? Right? Yeah, they would, but maybe a guest stayed longer than that. They stayed longer. Now, I've had guests sometimes over, and you haven't seen them for a while, and 2 or 3 hours can turn into 4 or 5 hours, and you just keep reminiscing about things that you remember from years gone by. But and they could stay up longer. But you remember the servants are there waiting for the master to return. They've still got their loins girded about. They're ready to serve. They've still got the lights burning, the lamps burning. Right? They're waiting on him to return there. And you remember, they don't have electricity. They don't have TV. They don't have things to entertain them after dark. Right? Most people, when they came in from work, and they worked right up close to dark time, they come in, they had their meal, they socialized for a little bit, and then they did what? They went to sleep. Right? They went to bed. Right? And they're refreshed the next day and ready to do it again at daybreak. They can start and work during the daylight hours there. And so most of these servants would expect their masters home from a wedding feast somewhere probably before 9 o'clock, definitely before midnight. Right? That's a long stay. Right? The blessing is, regardless how long the master waits before he returns home, they're still waiting. They're still ready. He isn't going to wake them up. He isn't going to have to try to come in the house with it dark and stumble around and get settled for the night. No, they're ready. They're waiting regardless how long it takes. Right? And the blessing is, we know God's going to reward that type of servant. Right? The one that's ready to serve. It does over and above the minimal effort. They could have went to sleep, and when the master knocked on the door, okay, jump up real quick and, tie your robe around yourself and get ready to serve and wait on him. But the blessing is for those that they're ready to serve. They don't have to get their robes girded about them. They don't have to get the lamps burning again. They don't have to do those things. Right? They enjoy sleep, but it's more important to be ready for the master, to serve him. Right? And look at verse 39. And this know that if the good man of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not have suffered his house to be broken through. Now that verse seems a little out of place, doesn't it? The servants are there at the house. Right? What are they worried about somebody breaking in for? Right? That seems just a little odd to it. We've seen the expectations of the steward, what God expects, the blessings of the servant. This is the warning to the good steward. Right? Even though they're there, right? Even though they're there, right? The blessing is God chooses us to be stewards. Right? The blessing is He tells us what's expected of us. Right? He'll reward us for doing that, and there's an extra blessing for being faithful all the time. Right? And then there's this warning there, right, about how valuable the things in the master's house are. How valuable they are. Sheila and I passed this house. I think I told you guys about it. Passed this house over on Route 7. So what's that been? A few weeks ago? Right? We didn't even see that house. We've been driving by that house for like 4 years. Right? And it sits kind of off the road there, kind of back in the woods. There isn't like a driveway that you can see how to even get to it or something. It's not very far off the road. And, when we looked over in that hole, I said, there's a house over there. And you could tell nobody lived there. Hadn't lived there in years. Right? It's just old and dilapidated and fallen in. And I said, where do you even get to that house? I said, I didn't even know there was a house over there. And we were talking about it, but there's nothing there of any value. There's nothing. It's just run down. It's not like you have to lock that up and the police have to drive by every once in a while and see if anybody's in there. I can guarantee you don't have to check no police reports or anything. I can guarantee nobody's robbed that place because there's nothing valuable to steal. There's nothing worth anything in there. Right? And that's what he's warning the stewards about. The servants are there at the house, but he's warning them Satan is going to try to steal some things, because they're valuable to God's kingdom. Satan is going to try to steal our testimony. He is going to try to steal our time. He is going to try to steal our energy. He's going to try to take those things because they're valuable to God's kingdom. And he's given them that warning there, right? That Satan's going to try to wreck something. That's why we keep our loins girded about. That's why we keep the lights burning. That's why we're ready day or night. When the Master calls, when we're ready to serve, when God gives us opportunities, even if that may not be convenient for us to do it at that particular time. Look at verse 40. Luke 12:40. He says, be ye therefore ready also, for the Son of Man cometh at an hour when ye think not. He's talking about the thief before that. Right? And now he's talking about the Master. The Master comes the same way. Jesus is going to come just as unexpectedly as the thief. Right? He's given us signs of the times. Right? Washington, D.C. today should be a really good sign for us, shouldn't it? Right? That's craziness, isn't it? It really is. When you march on the Capitol building and, and just kind of force your way in, That's an amazing thing in our culture today that we see going on. I don't anticipate that's going to end well, right? But we see those wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes in diverse places, and all those signs that God's given us, and we keep seeing. We see the signs already. They're just becoming more and more frequent, right? More and more obvious to us. The signs are there, and we don't know when Christ is coming back, but it could be any time. Just like the thief. Look at these last few verses. Peter asks a question, and then Jesus asks a question of his own. Look at verse 41 and 42. Then Peter said unto him, Lord, speakest thou this parable unto us, or even to all? And the Lord said, Who then is that faithful and wise steward whom his Lord shall make ruler over his household, to give them that portion of meat in due season? Now it seems like a simple question there that Peter asked. Is this just for the 12, or is this everybody? That's what he's saying. Is this just for the special little group, that just for the preachers? Is this all that applies to? Everybody got to follow by these same kind of rules. That's what he's asking there. Are the blessings for everybody, or just a select group get those? Are the promises for everybody? Is the warnings for everybody, or is that for just a few? Right? And Jesus answers his question with his own question. Right? Similar to what he gives in Matthew 22 about those who are invited to the wedding. They didn't put on the wedding garment. That wouldn't be required of them. But those who put on the wedding garment, those accept salvation. It is. Look at verse 43 through 46. We'll close. Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Of a truth I say unto you that he will make him ruler over all that he hath. And if that servant say in his heart, My Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to beat the men servants and maid servants, and to eat and drink and to be drunken, the Lord of that servant will come in a day when he looketh not for him, and at an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in sunder, and will appoint him his portion with the unbelievers. Right? Now that's the picture of the fake. That's the picture of the fake steward, not a true servant of God. Right? He says there, he's standing there. Right? He's acting like a servant. Right? There in verse 45. But the servant says in his heart, Well, my Lord delayed his coming. It's not going to happen soon. They've been saying that for years and years, that Jesus was going to come back. 2,000 years they've been saying that. He ain't come back yet. That's not going to happen. And they're going to go back to what? Like the Pharisees. They're going to go back to the old life. Right? They're going to beat the servants and do those, eat and drink and just do whatever they want to. They're going to turn away from God there. And that's the evidence. They're not true servants. They're not waiting for the master, waiting for him to return. The ones that don't do anything like the master says aren't his servants. That's what he's saying in those verses there. They're going to have their part with the unbelievers because that's what they are. They're fakes. That's part of that warning. Satan isn't trying to steal and fight and destroy anything from a person that isn't doing anything for God. He doesn't have to. He's already got it. Exactly right. Are we ready to serve? Is the light of God shining all the time in our lives? Are we waiting for opportunities? When the master knocks in that picture of that story there, the master knocks and they open immediately. I hope that's our testimony, that when God calls us to do something, God, whether that's teach a class or witness to somebody, go visit somebody, and when God knocks, that we go do that then. Not say, well, I'll try to do that next week, or I'll try to do that maybe next month when I got a vacation. I'll try to do that. That's not the picture that Jesus gives. Here, when God says, you need to do that, that's probably the time to do it. Right then. Okay. Any questions?